This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports, and welcome to another episode of the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. I'm Dan Newman, the co-host of the Hello, Old Sports podcast, joined, as always, by my brother, Andrew Newman. Andrew, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Dan. I'm actually very excited. Recently you've had us. We've interviewed a number of people who've written books, and I've had to read a little faster than I'm accustomed to get through all of them. But that was not the case with this one. It's a very interesting subject, especially for us being Yankee fans. And just the way the book was written, it was I breezed through it in I think 3 sessions. So I'm excited to get started.
Our special guest, Dan Taylor, author of Baseball at the Abyss: The Scandals of 1926, Babe Ruth, and the Unlikely Savior Who Rescued a Tarnished Game. Dan Taylor, thanks so much for joining us today on Hello, Old Sports.
Always great to be with a fellow Dan, and in this case, an Andrew, too.
Thank you. So Andrew told you that, he read through the book and really enjoyed it. And I really did, too. And so just to sort of start off, tell us a little bit about the book, because you kind of are almost telling 2 stories at once here, which I thought was interesting. So just sort of give us an idea of what your book is about.
Well, the elevator pitch, since you kind of stole my thunder there, is that it's a book with 2 stories. Certainly begins with the scandals that erupted at the end of the 1926 season, a game-fixing allegation and game betting accusation against 2 of the biggest stars in the game, Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker, which made it a huge scandal, and some sports writers felt it was even bigger than the Black Sox scandal. And then as that plays out, we have the second part of the story, which is Babe Ruth, whose life at that point was a real train wreck, and who was the first player to have an agent, or in that case, a business manager who was really trying to get Ruth's career back on track and also set him up for some big earnings to head him into retirement in a good place, and had him try to get his game back in order by working out and getting in shape. And we think of the fat Babe Ruth, but in actuality, in 1927, Babe Ruth was a very svelte guy. That was the year he hit 60 home runs, and as a result of working out, he kind of set the tone for decades to come in baseball, and was the first player to embrace what is now commonplace, strength and conditioning, and in doing so had one of the greatest seasons in baseball history.
Yeah, and my brother knows that's always been sort of a pet peeve of mine when people who aren't historians, baseball history people, talk about Babe Ruth. It's like they saw a picture of him, maybe he was with the Braves in 1935, and then they remember John Goodman playing him in a movie, and they're like, oh, he was this great big fat guy. And it's like, no, he really wasn't. Maybe the last year or 2 of his career, but for the most part, and especially the time period you write about here, he was in tremendous shape for the time.
About 24, 25, 26, it started to get away from him. But yeah, his early years, first with Boston, then with the Yankees, he was a tremendous athlete. He ran well. He had a great arm, of course. Was a tremendous pitcher for about 4 seasons with the Red Sox, and then decided he wanted to hit and had more fun hitting than pitching. And he was a very dynamic outfielder, acrobatic outfielder. Very good base runner, had good foot speed, and of course the power. He was very unique for that era. Home run Baker's 12 had kind of set the standard, and then he comes along and just shatters that, really obliterates that idea, and really changed the game.
One of Andrew's and I think you write about if you don't write about this specifically in the book, you at least allude to it. He's part of his training regime was he started to box. And there's this famous movie clip of him in a boxing gym. I think it was in New York, and he's like, "Oh, what's the idea with these boxing gloves?" And he's like punching with the guy. Like, "What's the idea here?" And it's that's always been one of our favorite clips. But like you said, it was a different thing. This whole idea of a baseball player, any athlete, working out in the off season on a workout regime to get in shape.
Well, as you probably remembered, in spring training in 1925, he collapsed twice. Once getting off the train in Asheville, North Carolina, when the Yankees were going there for an exhibition game, and then the next day on a train as he was coming into New York City, and he was hospitalized. And initially, the doctors, both in Asheville and in New York, said it's just overeating, and he really was terrible that way. He was a glutton. His teammates were just shocked at the way he ate. But in this case, it was really something much worse, and it necessitated stomach surgery, which caused him to miss the first 2 months of the 1925 season. You may recall that when he was on that train and collapsed, well, actually, when he collapsed in Asheville and then was on the train to New York the next day, there were reports, they emanated from Canada, but also came out over the BBC in England that he had died. And along the journey, they actually had agents come on the train to check to see if it was true. But yeah, so in his rehab after the surgery in 25, he worked with a guy in New York by the name of Artie McGovern. Mm-hmm. And McGovern was a former boxer who had created kind of a physical therapy business. He had been beaten up so many times and so badly in the ring that he learned a lot about recovery. And he worked with a lot of doctors to rehab their patients and developed quite an interesting training and rehab business in Manhattan. And so Ruth worked with him to strengthen his core following the surgery. And then at the end of the season, they worked a little bit as well. But when he was coming to Hollywood, Christy Walsh, who was his business manager, felt that he would have a captive audience if he could work, if they could get McGovern in to work with Ruth while he was making the movie in the winter of 1927. And McGovern had sized up Ruth very quickly. And to your point, he realized Ruth was a real competitive guy. And so he thought, jumping rope or just putting him on a stationary bike just wasn't going to work. Ruth was going to get bored. He wasn't going to do it. But if he could create some competitive endeavors, that Ruth would really get into it. And so boxing was one of them. Ruth did box a lot. They would get a lot of Hollywood extras, and they'd throw them in the ring between takes during the filming sessions and box with him. And the other thing he liked to do was to play racquetball. And so he would set up racquetball games for Ruth and even a tennis game with Bill Tilden, who was one of the great players of that day. So, yeah, McGovern did an interesting job that way in the cardio work with Ruth. And Ruth really did take to boxing.
And like a lot of things that Babe Ruth did, it had the mix of being substantively important, but also a great PR opportunity.
Oh, Christy Walsh never missed a beat. I mean, he never missed the chance to get a camera in front of Ruth, to get something in the paper about him. And that's how their relationship began in 1921. Christy Walsh had the idea to create a syndicated news service built around ghostwriting, which in terms of using sports figures was really quite unique. And he hired sports writers to write columns. In a case of Babe Ruth, who was really his first big client, he actually staked his business on being able to land Babe Ruth. And then he got a top sports writer who would ghostwrite twice a week column for Babe Ruth. And anytime there was an opportunity to get Ruth in front of a camera, a visit to an orphanage, a check presentation here or there, doing something with kids, Christy Walsh was remarkable that way. And of course, when he was training in Hollywood, the event with Bill Tilden was probably more a photo op than actually a training session.
Yeah, Ruth is such an interesting. I was saying this to my brother the other day, where it'll sound like a ridiculous comparison, but almost like you can't really write a book about Abraham Lincoln. You have to write 10 books, or you have to focus on one specific aspect of his life. Ruth, and I've read it's interesting because I read a book specifically about the 1923 season, and sort of the off season of 23 between 22 and 23 was very similar in that Ruth had a disappointing 1922. He had a horrible World Series. And he basically said, I'm going back to my farm in Massachusetts to get in shape. Now, it wasn't as regimented as the period we're talking about now, but it's almost like every couple of years early in his Yankee tenure, he would have these kind of fall-offs where he wasn't taking care of himself. He wasn't disciplined enough, and then he would have to come back. And in this way, obviously, this was the most dramatic of them because he did it with Christy Walsh's help and McGovern. And I think one thing we almost can't take for granted is that he got linked up with a fitness guy who actually seemed to know what he was talking about, which back then you couldn't really take for granted. He could have had him doing something that wasn't really physiologically sound, and nobody really would have been able to call that out at the time.
Well, you're right. Even today, that's a huge headache. I'm acquainted with a lot of Major League Baseball strength coaches, and they often have told me that their biggest fear is the off season and where their players are going to wind up training in the off season and who they're going to listen to and what wacky ideas might get thrown at them. And so I was really struck by that here, Ruth didn't just train, but he had a guy who really knew what he was talking about. And I looked at some of the eating plans the guy put him on, and you compare them to eating plans today, they're really very sound. Had him more on proteins and things of that nature. And so it was really interesting that Artie McGovern was way ahead of his time and an early innovator in that particular field of nutrition as well as strength and conditioning. So, that's really remarkable that Ruth was able to connect with someone because that was a problem in a lot of aspects of Babe Ruth's life that everybody wanted a piece of him. And he really got cheated and screwed a lot, particularly his first 2-3 years with the Yankees. And then, once he connected with Christy Walsh, here was a guy that he found that he could trust. And Christy Walsh helped sift out the riffraff and connect him with people who really could help him. And this was certainly a key example of that.
Where is he in his personal life at this point? His first marriage is sort of basically, for all intents and purposes, broken up, right?
Correct. And that was part of the issue. Ruth at that time, between the 26 and 27 seasons, his life was really a train wreck. He was broke. For all intents and purposes, he was broke. And his first marriage breaking up was one of the reasons. He settled. They never divorced because they were both very strong practicing Catholics, and so they would not divorce. So he gave her his Massachusetts farm and gave her $100,000 cash. And so, he had been fooling around with the woman who became his second wife. And there were a lot of other financial issues at play there as well. I mean, he loved to play the horses. He never won. There was an infamous story about a barnstorming opportunity he had in Cuba where he was paid $15,000 to come to Cuba, play with a Cuban team, and play in several exhibition games in Cuba. And he hadn't been down in Cuba very long when he wired his bank for another $15,000 because he'd lost the $15,000 he was paid for coming to Cuba at the horse track. And then I believe ultimately he had to wire for yet a third batch of money to be able to get home. And that was the way he was. He spent lavishly on clothes and never thought twice about leaving them in closets when he finished road trips, leaving them behind in hotels. He had 9 luxury automobiles, very high-priced luxury automobiles. So, he spent money as fast as he made it. And that was another area where Christy Walsh was very concerned and really felt that this particular offseason between the 26 and 27 seasons was a year when he had to do something pretty big to get Ruth back on track financially, but also set him up for life after baseball.
I think it's also interesting to note that from a purely on-the-field point of view, Ruth is not necessarily, I mean, the numbers are great. And even if Ruth never played a game after the 1926 season, he would still probably be considered, if not the greatest, one of the greatest offensive baseball players of all time. But at the end of 26, he's only won 1 World Series. He had
he's won 1 World Series
with the Yankees as a position player with the Yankees. He'd won 3 in Boston.
3 in Boston.
And yet he had a terrible year in 25, right? Like numbers that were mediocre. And then 26 was a little bit better year, but maybe tell us a little bit. The 1926 World Series didn't necessarily end so well for Babe Ruth.
No, and I think some of that, one of the most inexplicable base running decisions in the history of the game. With 2 outs in the top of the 9th inning and the Yankees trailing, Ruth decides to try and steal second base and gets thrown out. That's the end of the World Series. Yankees lose. Unbelievable. And of course, Miller Huggins, the Yankee manager, excused Ruth and said he was, he had good intentions, but at the same time, I think there was a big brain fart there. But yeah, the 26 season he bounced back somewhat, but most sports writers were really suggesting that he was coming to the end of the road. The 25, of course, the stomach surgery and all that really affected his game. He did not have a good season. He was suspended during that season for insubordination in St. Louis, and attempted to go. He was suspended, told to go home to New York. Instead, went to Chicago to try to appeal to Commissioner Landis to lift the suspension, even though it was by the Yankees and not the commissioner. And the Yankee owner summoned him home to New York and really chastised him and told Ruth he wasn't going to get back on the field until he apologized to the manager, who also wanted the apology made in front of the team. So yeah, he missed a lot of time that season and did not play well. 26, there was a bit of a bounce back, but it was not a significant bounce back. And that's where Christy Walsh really stepped in and knew that Ruth had to do something, that there was still some baseball in Ruth, and he had to get himself back in shape and try to extend his career. And fortunately, that he listened and was able to do that.
We obviously will return to Ruth as we talk about the home run chase and introduce another character in Lou Gehrig. But our last two exchanges, we've discussed both gambling and Kennesaw Mountain Landis. So I feel like now might be a good time for us to circle back to the other major plot in your book, especially the early part of it. Can you explain sort of the inciting incident, way back in, several years before this? What was the germ of the scandal, with it involving Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker? And then how did it come to a boil right as the 1926 off season was beginning?
Well, in September of 1919, the Tigers were hosting Cleveland in a 3-game series. And after the second game of the series, Ty Cobb, who was the player manager of the Tigers, and Dutch Leonard, one of his pitchers, they happened to bump into Tris Speaker, the player manager of Cleveland, and Smokey Joe Wood, pitcher with Cleveland, who had been Dutch Leonard's roommate. Both were with the Boston Red Sox years earlier. And the White Sox they pretty much locked up the American League pennant. Cleveland had second place pretty well sewn up. And it was a battle between Detroit and the New York Yankees for third. And Cobb made mention to Speaker how they could really use a win to nail down third place. Every place in the standings meant a little bit more money. And so the Tiger players were really keen to get that third place money. And so Cobb vented to Speaker, who was a friend, that they could really use some help. And Speaker's alleged comment was, "You guys will win tomorrow, even if I have to pitch." Those four ultimately left that meeting and thought, well, since we know the outcome of the game tomorrow, let's go put some money on it. And there was an employee at the ballpark in Detroit that, according to testimony, regularly made wagers on behalf of Cobb. Smokey Joe Wood put some money down on the game as well, and allegedly Speaker did. And Detroit won quite handily. And the sports writers, in their articles about that particular game, were really puzzled by the way Cleveland played that day. And Tris Speaker's comment when he was pressed about it was, well, we wanted to get out of there fast so that we could take the train home and not have to take the boat home. And it didn't sound like people really bought into it at all. Now, after this game and after the season, both Cobb and Tris Speaker sent letters to Dutch Leonard. And Leonard had kept those letters in his drawer for 7 years, never had any intent to do anything with them. In Cobb's notes, it thanked him, but they were a little bit vague. But in Smokey Joe Wood's letter, it made mention that also in that envelope was a check for, I believe it was $1,600. and it talked about their wagering on the game. So in the fall of 26, Dutch Leonard's talking to a former Tigers teammate, Harry Heilman, and he lets slip that he has these letters from Wood and Cobb. Well, Heilman, like a lot of guys who played for Ty Cobb, hated Ty Cobb. And he pressed Leonard. He said, listen, I'm talking to Frank Navin, the owner of the Tigers, tomorrow at such and such a time. If he has not heard about these letters, I'm telling him. You've got to tell him about the letters. And Leonard really stewed over what to do. His wife was insistent that he not turn the letters over. She thought that they would get a lot of backlash. They would become pariahs with their friends in baseball. They had a big farm and mansion here in Central California where he had a large farm. And they frequently entertained ball players. And she was a former vaudeville actress, so a lot of entertainers came to hang out on the farm. And she was afraid of how they would react. And ultimately, Leonard felt that he was placed between a rock and a hard spot and had no choice. So he did call Frank Navin. He told him about the letters. He turned the letters over to Frank Navin, who was shocked by their content. And Navin turned the letters over to Ban Johnson, the president of the American League. Johnson had a force of detectives. They looked into it. They came back and told him that this was legit, that it very likely happened, that a game was thrown, that these players and player managers did bet on the game. So Ban Johnson summoned Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker to his office in Chicago. They were on a hunting trip in November in Wyoming, 26, and they came to his office, and he laid out what he knew. And he told them, I cannot prove without a shadow of a doubt that you did fix this game, but you did bet on it, and you were managers. And that's enough for me. You're through with baseball. And he said, but in respect to your careers and respect to your family, we will not say why you're leaving the game. We'll give you the opportunity to say why you're leaving baseball. And the next day, Ty Cobb announced his retirement, said that he just didn't want to manage anymore, that the Tigers weren't going to be competitive, and just didn't feel like it was a team he wanted to manage, and felt like he was at the end of the road as a player. Tris Speaker, on the other hand, was a little vague because he had led Cleveland to a second-place finish. The fans in Cleveland were excited, and Speaker, he was a little vague about why he was stepping away from the game. And that caused media to do a little bit of digging. Ultimately, a reporter for the Chicago Tribune got wind of what had happened, approached Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who had been briefed on the matter. But Landis kind of had a feeling that maybe Ban Johnson didn't tell him everything. And Landis came out to California. He met with Dutch Leonard. Leonard showed him copies of the letter. And not long after, it was about Christmas Eve or thereabouts, the word got out. The Chicago Tribune printed a big story about it, and Cobb decided to fight. And he claimed he made a lot of crazy accusations about Dutch Leonard and decided he was going to fight. And Landis decided that he had to have hearings. And at that point, more rumors of thrown games started to come out. Swede Risberg, the shortstop for the 1919 Chicago White Sox, the Black Sox, he was said to be the ringleader of the Black Sox scandal. He made claims to a newspaper reporter of more fixed games, some of which involved Cobb. So Landis ended up holding hearings in January of 27. And it really was just a lot of hearsay. There was no concrete evidence. And at the end of the hearings, he cleared everybody. But then reporters realized he wasn't dealing with the whole Dutch Leonard, Tris Speaker, Ty Cobb matter, and they pressed him on it. And what was happening behind the scenes was both Cobb and Speaker had retained attorneys. These attorneys were pressing for a hearing in which they could face their accuser, in this case, Dutch Leonard. And Leonard had been threatened, and he steadfastly refused to go to Chicago for the hearing. And Landis felt like he had no choice but to reinstate Cobb and Speaker. And the owner of the Tigers said he did not want Cobb back. Cleveland's owner said the same thing. Cobb signed with Philadelphia, played 2 final seasons there with Connie Mack and the A's, and Speaker played a year with Washington and a year with Philadelphia. and then called it a career. But there were a lot of people felt that because it was such big names involved, Cobb and Speaker, that this was far worse than the Black Sox scandal. And a lot of columnists said this really sent baseball's reputation into the gutter, that it was akin to wrestling and horse racing, that you really couldn't trust the outcome of games anymore. And baseball going into the 27th season was in a really bad place.
So just to sort of give a little bit of background here for those listeners who may not be aware, it was a little bit of a different situation in baseball in the 1920s. And in some ways, this paradigm kind of continues up until the days of Bud Selig. And what that is that there's a commissioner, but then there's also an American League president and National League president with some degree of autonomy over those individual leagues. And I've talked before about
and real quick, Dan Johnson was the president of the American League as long as there had been an American League, and predated the system that had him subservient to anybody. So
yeah, and that was another piece of it I was going to get to. I was going to talk about how even into the early 90s, I remember going to a game at Yankee Stadium and catching a foul ball, and the ball had the signature of the American League president on it, who was actually Bobby Brown, the former Yankee who passed away a couple years ago. And that was sort of the way things worked in baseball forever. And as you go back further and further, there was more of this autonomy for the league presidents. And as Andrew mentioned, Ban Johnson had founded the American League. He'd been the guy who really fought to make it a second major league with the National League that had been around for about 25 years before that. And for pretty much the whole dead ball era, that first 20 years of the 20th century, that was the governing structure that survived. There was an American League president, a National League president. I think there was a third member of a commission. Black Sox scandal comes in, scares the hell out of baseball people. And then they bring in Kennesaw Mountain Landis to be this sort of all-powerful commissioner. But there's still sort of these remnants of the old system where the league presidents had some degree of autonomy over their leagues. And Dan, I think that that's sort of another one of these interesting subplots of this whole story, is that the rivalry between Landis and Johnson, which at this point is 6 or 7 years old, kind of impacts the way that both men deal with this scandal.
It was ugly. And to your point, Ban Johnson was a really interesting guy. He was an autocrat. He'd been a sports writer in Ohio, took control of a minor league, the Western League, and he built it up into the American League and then gained major league status. And that structure back then, there was kind of an umbrella organization, the National Commission, and it was a rule by committee. Then the American and National Leagues were like two different companies. You know, they were like Coke and Pepsi, if you will. I mean, they were two different companies. And Ban Johnson ruled the American League with an iron thumb. He was a real strict guy. And he was really offended when Kennesaw Mountain Landis was given the powers that he was given and made the commissioner. And he worked a lot to undermine him. There was a lot of leaks to the media, a lot of crazy stuff that went on. And this incident really pushed Landis to a breaking point. And he was about to call, or he had summoned all the owners to Chicago for a meeting in which he was going to lower the boom. He was going to tell them, it's Ban Johnson or me. You guys have to get rid of it. And before that could happen, Ban Johnson knew what was happening. He was having a lot of health issues, and he surprisingly showed up at a meeting, an American League meeting, and a meeting of American League owners, and announced that he was going to step down for health reasons, and that really ended the feud with Landis. But one of the things with Ban Johnson, he was always upset about the Black Sox scandal of 1919 because of the way it painted the American League. And he was forever trying to claim that World Series prior to that had been thrown by National League teams. There was a lot of talk that the Giants threw the 1917 World Series. And he pressed that constantly and begged for an investigation and never got it. Now, Landis claimed after these hearings in January of 27 that he had investigated claims of the 17 World Series potentially being fixed, and he found nothing to it. And both men, Landis and Johnson, had access to these large teams of private investigators and were constantly following up leads and tips about players being on the take and games being fixed. And it was so out of control back then. It really was. And the surprising thing to me was that, when Landis ruled as he did on the White Sox players following the trial in 21, he didn't put a lot of additional measures into place. And when this scandal came about, a lot of Swede Risberg's accusations were excused for being not bribes, but gifts. And what they were claiming back then was that it was very common that if your club was battling another club for a spot in the standings, a final spot in the standings, and it would mean some money, that it was not uncommon for the team that benefited to pool some money or buy suits of clothes or whatever for the team that beat the team that you were battling for that spot in the standings. And so some of these games that Swede Risberg complained about, the players involved simply said, no, we didn't bribe these guys with money. We gave them gifts and thanked them for what they did. And so that was when Landis finally stepped in and put a number of things in place after the 27 hearings that it surprises me he didn't do in 21. But things like gifts and whatnot, they meant in many cases either full season or lifetime bans from baseball. So that was really when Landis ratcheted things up a notch, using these hearings in 27, ultimately get rid of Ban Johnson and also put a lot more safeguards in place to guard against fixed games and players betting on games.
It's really amazing how much this story touches on so many of the previous either scandals or issues in the 20 years prior in baseball. I mean, just alone in this story, accusations are cast about the 1917 World Series, I think the 1923 World Series, the Yankees and the Giants. Obviously, guys like Swede Risberg and Chick Gandil get a second act that I didn't know they were a part of this story. And then just one additional wrinkle that occurred to me because I read a book on this. One of the players in that meeting with Speaker and Cobb was Smokey Joe Wood. And this wasn't the series itself, but a game in the series. There have always been rumors that in 1912, he had pitched so well in the series for the Red Sox and so well all season. And since a game had gotten called for darkness, but the owners were, they weren't going to give the players any share of the money for the game that got called for darkness, that he went out and intentionally lost game 7, which was actually game 6. And, the implication being that he'd been so good, he let up 7 runs in the first 2 innings, turned around and pitched amazingly the next day, and the Red Sox beat the Giants in the World Series. But there's always been sort of a hint in that game that Smokey Joe Wood intentionally lost that game, probably as a way to get back at the owners and also to put some money in his own pocket. So you really it goes back a decade and a half now with this story touching on possible improprieties.
And to Smokey Joe Wood's involvement in this 1919 game and then the hearings in 27, Cobb and Speaker went out of their way to try and protect him. He had, following his baseball career, one of his sons was playing at Yale, and Yale hired Smokey Joe Wood as their head baseball coach. And it was a great opportunity for him, a good living for he and his family. And Cobb and Speaker went out of their way to protect him. They did not want this to cost him his job. And Yale did pull him in and talk to him about it. And they issued a statement that they were satisfied that he did nothing wrong and he would remain as their head coach. But there were a lot of interesting implications that swirled around Smokey Joe Wood over the years in his career. And it was interesting because he was so well liked by teammates and peers that here in this particular instance, in January of 27, some of the principals involved really went to great lengths to protect him.
There's a great book, and not to keep talking about other books, but yours, Dan, because yours books was incredible, and we both enjoyed it very much. But just to sort of take this in a slightly different direction for a second, there's a book by, if you're a baseball fan, you probably know this book. It's called Glory of Their Times by Lawrence Ritter, and it was basically an oral history of basically, the dead ball era. And Wood was interviewed for this book. He gave sort of an on the record interview, and then he gave a second interview to Ritter where he kind of confessed to the whole thing a little bit more. And that I think that interview just has been published, within the last 10 years or so. So he was definitely one of those guys who, like you said, kind of protected things while he was alive, but was willing to let the truth go a little bit. And then I think the other thing I kind of want to ask, because you really kind of touch on the timeline really well about Cobb especially, but both of them, Cobb especially, why is it, do you think, that he is so willing at the beginning to just sort of slink away quietly, but then so eager to fight to the death over this whole thing once it gets public? Is it just the fact that it's public and he doesn't want his reputation, or what changes with Cobb?
Well, I think the fact that it was public changed everything. I think that he knew he was near the end of the road, and he wasn't going to beat Ban Johnson. He knew how strong Ban Johnson's authority was, and so he was willing to accept it. He wasn't happy about it, but he was willing to accept it and just move on. But some of the great sports writers, when he started fighting it, there were some of the top sports writers of the day who said, "Wait a minute, what guy accepts this and walks away and then accepts a ruling like this if he wasn't guilty?" And I think that's what a lot of people close to it thought. But Cobb just went scorched earth. His father was a politician, and he knew how to play the game. I mean, one of the first things he did was he got on a train to Washington, D.C.
I like this. This is one of my favorite parts of the book. Yeah.
And he goes right to Washington, D.C. And I mean, the things he did was crazy. They were crazy. They didn't have a chance at all of succeeding, but it got him a lot of publicity and a lot of sympathy. I mean, he went to the head of the post office, and said, "This has got to be a crime because Dutch Leonard used the mail." He went to people in Congress and in the Senate and asked them to open hearings into what Dutch Leonard was doing to him. And they all, of course, jumped on the soapbox and said, "This is terrible and we'll do what we can." But then privately, they would tell newspapermen, "Oh, I don't know what we can do about this. This isn't in our jurisdiction. I don't think there's anything we can do." And then he gets on a train and goes to Chicago and holds court with all the media in a hotel suite. And he's crying and, how could Dutch Leonard do this to me? And then he goes to Detroit and holds court for the writers who he had known for so many years in Detroit, and very emotional. And what's Dutch Leonard doing to me? He's just being vindictive because I released him, and Dutch Leonard got hurt. And then he tried to make the claim that Leonard did it for money, and then Cobb tried to claim that, "Oh, well, during the 27 season, I warned Kennesaw Mountain Landis that Leonard was shopping these letters around to people in the East for money." Well, that's crazy. And Leonard insisted that what money he did get from the American League was an injury settlement, and it had nothing to do with the letters. That it was just coincidental that the timing was, fairly similar. But Cobb seized on that, and the newspapers ran with it, that Leonard sold the letters, and he had sold his soul, and he was a Judas, and on and on and on. And, the media just lapped it all up. And, of course, Leonard remained quiet and wasn't going to make comments and was just going to move on with his life. And he got slaughtered. And there's a lot of people for many, many decades that still believed Cobb's insistence. One of the things I tried to do, because the New York Daily News came out with something. I did not include it in the book because I thought it was a little outrageous, but the New York Daily News came up with something where a writer wrote that he had come out to Fresno, which is where I live, and that he had gone to the county and and looked at Dutch Leonard's records, and that Leonard was near bankruptcy, and that Leonard needed money desperately, and kind of reaffirming Cobb's claims. And I went and looked that year. Dutch Leonard was one of the biggest grape growers in America. He had more than 2,000 acres, and I was looking at the price that year for grapes, raisin grapes, wine grapes, and even if Dutch Leonard had a bad year and was only able to sell 10% of his crop, he still would have gotten six figures in 26, 27. So I really, just going through the farming records here and what the crop prices were and the tonnage that you would get for an acre of grapes and things of that nature, I had a real hard time believing the claims that Leonard was struggling financially. And the same article said that Leonard's wife pushed him to do it. And there were a number of articles in the newspaper here in Fresno once it all broke where, Muriel, his wife, Muriel, was insistent that he not reveal these letters. So,
and it seems like all of his reservations about getting involved came true, and then some.
Oh, absolutely, yes, in a big way. Yeah, he. I don't know how that tainted him the rest of his life. I don't know if it did. I mean, he what was really interesting, he just, when he held out one year, he took up golf, and he became one of the best golfers amateur golfers in California. And there's still courses here and around Fresno where there's plaques up there from him winning club and city championships. And it was really interesting because I've known the pro at the club that he belonged to. I've known the pro for many, many years. And I asked him when I was doing research for the book about Dutch Leonard. He goes, I heard something about a guy by that name once. Oh, but we got some guys in their 80s and 90s. I'll see if any of them know anything about him. And they said, we kind of cleaned out a lot of old memorabilia, and we probably threw his stuff away. Oh,
Go ahead, Dan. I'm sorry.
So we want to sort of pivot back to the 27 season here in a second, but let's just sort of put a fine point on it. Dan, this happened, right?
It did.
Yeah.
No question. It did.
I guess the question is, and this is more rhetorical, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, and Andrew's too, actually. You wonder whether something like this was that big of a deal. Now, whether it should have been is another question, but it sounds as if, first of all, it was almost like the decision to lose the game came before the decision to bet on it, which is
correct.
Maybe that's a distinction without a difference, but it's interesting to note. And, you read stories about whether it's John McGraw and sort of his close relationships with gamblers, switching sports for a minute, Andrew and I, being native New Yorkers, we're, New York Giants football fans. And Tim Mara founded the New York Giants in 1925. He was a bookmaker. He was a legal bookmaker. And that was how he got his money to buy and found a team that's been now in the NFL for going on 100 years. So, obviously, what happened only a few weeks later in the World Series changed the way everybody looked at gamblers and baseball. But you wonder if they necessarily, Cobb, Speaker, Wood, you wonder if they even realized the sort of the extent of what they were doing when they did it, or if it was just sort of no big deal. This wasn't like throwing a World Series.
Well, a couple of thoughts to that. And no, I think it was no big deal to them because I think they had done it before. This is just my guess from everything I've pieced together. When a guy who works at the ballpark in Detroit is subpoenaed to testify in front of Landis and comes in with forged betting slips to protect Cobb, and he is described as the guy who was basically Cobb's runner, making his bets for him, that suggests to me that this particular game with Cleveland wasn't a one-shot deal. Mm-hmm. If he has a guy who everybody knows is placing bets for Cobb, so Cobb doesn't get caught, that would certainly suggest Cobb's been doing stuff like this for a while. Cobb was an immensely competitive guy. And one of the things that I think I mentioned in the book was that when Van Johnson was investigating this, he talked about having had an investigator following the Cleveland Ball Club for the entire season, and that private investigator in his report said those players in the dugout never once talked about baseball. The conversation during every game was about what was happening at the local track. So it was a very common thing for ball players then. It was they were competitive individuals. Plus, they weren't paid greatly, looking to make extra money. Similar to Ruth, in a sense, a lot of fans loved giving them tips. They rubbed elbows with a lot of gamblers. I mean, I touch on the Rogers Hornsby.
I was just about to mention that. Yeah.
And they were in the company of a lot of gamblers and who wanted information in exchange for friendship. And so, yeah, it was really common back then. And some of that, when you look at that, it scares me today with where baseball's going. But we can talk about that later.
We could talk about it later, or we could take 2 minutes on it right now, because I think Andrew and I don't want to speak for him, but I think we're sort of in agreement on this, that sports need to be real careful, that this is not just something that happened for 2 weeks in 1919.
Well, and that was the point I was going to make about this whole thing, which is it's been well documented, and I think fairly so, how much of a black eye the 1919 White Sox, the 8 men out famously, gave baseball and sports at the time with what they did. In almost equal measure, they took the fall for a lot of things and I don't mean they took the fall like they didn't do it, but it was easy to say, look at what these 8 guys did, and look at how just these 8 guys throwing these particular games, look at how much they tarnished baseball, which was always clean before that and was always clean after that. And anybody who knows anything knows that's not true. They know that things like we're talking about now happened all the time. The most benign explanation was that Ty Cobb knew his team was going to win the next day and bet on his team. But, like you said, the fact that they were so easily writing letters about it shows you that they didn't think it was something that was that out of the ordinary that they really needed to cover their tracks about it. So I think when you talk about the modern era with gambling, and, that's one positive to how much guys make now, is somebody's probably not going to throw a game to make $5,000, but there's a reason for 100 years, and I'm not even talking morally, because I don't care if people want to bet on sports, who aren't involved. There's a reason that for so long there was this big wall between sports and gambling, that these leagues had in place with the players and the owners and the teams, TV. And we didn't just that basically just went away in an instant. And now, you wonder, when is we've had a few suspensions and things, but you wonder when's the first major problem going to happen in this post-gambling, legalized, fully sanctioned by the league era?
Yeah.
Well, you just look at the NFL over the last few months. You've had several players who have been suspended for gambling. There's rumors now about a player, an exorbitant dollar figures bet. There's so many ways to gamble. There's so many people involved in gambling. I think the common answer to that is, they're so well, like you alluded to, Andrew, they're so well compensated, they don't have any motivation to gamble. My response to that is, money is not the issue. It's competitiveness. These guys are competitive. And there's just so many reasons to gamble. And we're not just talking about gambling in the States. We're not talking just about players that are U.S. citizens. What about what can go on in Puerto Rico, the Dominican, other areas in the world? And there's a lot of gambling that goes on, obviously, that is not in a regulated setting that you have to be concerned with. I think there's a lot of software safeguards that have been put in place for the legalized forms of gambling, but there's a lot of other forms of gambling that can take place where very concerning things could happen. And I do worry that we could have a huge scandal. I think the thing you look at is, what the Black Sox scandal did if that had just been a series against the Browns, I don't know that anybody really would have made a big deal about it. Ban Johnson probably would have punished these guys and probably kept it somewhat quiet. But in the World Series, this really called into question the integrity of the sport and the validity of results in the game. And that's where Ruth initially, in 22 after the 21-22 after the court case, and then in 27 after this situation. Here's a 6'2", 200-pound guy hitting the ball, through windows outside of ballparks, and that can't be fixed. People are saying, no, this is legitimate. This is incredible talent. This is not rigged. These guys are throwing fastballs and curves, knuckleballs and spitters to try to get him out, and so that did reinstate the integrity of the game. But yeah, I'm really concerned about baseball just being a scandal away from having some real serious trouble.
Occasionally on this podcast, I will have sort of a half-formed thought that I just come up with, and this is going to be one of those instances. I feel like in a lot of ways, Ruth's personality was perfect for this because, look, the man had his vices, obviously, food, booze, women, just, driving fast. I mean, didn't he? I don't know where I read this, but he crashed like 6 cars one month or something like that. Yeah. But his sort of, I don't know, wrong word to use here, but his sort of childlike personality, plus the fact that he was making so much money from endorsements and every other damn thing, he was not a guy who was going to be touched by the gambling piece of it because he was just so intent on just, living every moment to its fullest with home runs, with whatever. So you don't hear of a whiff of sort of the gambling stuff with Ruth. So I think not just his skill, but his personality sort of made him immune to the gambling influence, I would say.
Well, you're right. And Landis was asked when all this broke out about Ruth, and he said Ruth would never do anything like this. In fact, when Ruth was asked about this, when Sweet Risberg came out with his claims, Ruth said Sweet Risberg needs to be strung up by his ankles and dropped in boiling oil. He had a love of the game. He had an appreciation for the game. And I think a lot of that had to do with his upbringing, at St. Mary's, being in that environment. I think, he was really, he was a ruffian. There's no question. Had a tough upbringing. But I do think, that those priests at St. Mary's really instilled a sense of right and wrong in Babe Ruth. And with everything baseball was doing for him, bringing him that adulation that was really missing from his childhood, I think that the idea of hurting the game was just something that was foreign to him. It was not acceptable to him, and I don't think he was going to go down that road. Yeah, he had his vices. There's no question, but I think in terms of illegal gambling or fixing games, things of that nature, no, there was not a chance of him crossing that line.
Should we, and we obviously won't have the time to go month by month or anything like that, but should we just sort of briefly touch on the 27 season, the home run chase, and Lou Gehrig, who for the first 4 months or 4+ months of the season was really matching Ruth shot for shot.
And that was just enthralling the country, that Ruth actually had competition in the home run race. And there were a lot of sports writers around the country that were saying baseball has a new home run hero. Ruth's days are done, and Lou Gehrig is the new hero. Gehrig had a tremendous season, matched Ruth. Ruth got off to a very slow start. He picked up a bad head cold late in spring training. They played some exhibition games in very cold weather. And he and a few other players got bad head colds. So he got off to a bit of a slow start, but about May, he really started to get cranking and went on a huge binge. And then not long after was when Gehrig started matching him, and it was thrilling. I mean, this was a year when Charles Lindbergh flew across made that first transatlantic flight, and he only got adulation for just a brief few days, and then the country turned its attention back to Gehrig and Ruth. This was spectacular, and you look at the attendance that some teams pulled in during the course of the season. I mean, almost 47% of the Red Sox home attendance that season came from those 12 games with the Yankees. I mean, that's what the battle with Gehrig and Ruth was doing around the American League. It just was a huge headline writer and a tremendous form of excitement. Of course, as a team, the Yankees, they were out in front all year long and ran away with the pennant. I mean, they had it in the bag by the 4th of July.
And in fact, the team that they finished ahead of by 14 games or whatever was the Philadelphia Athletics with the newly signed Ty Cobb, but it was never a pennant race, and that was the famed 27 Yankees, and that 1927 was the year that the Yankees became the Yankees in a lot of ways, that Ruth became Ruth the legend, wins another World Series, wins another one the following year, hits the 60 home runs, which stays the record. So he really did, sort of to turn a phrase here, he really did bring baseball back from the abyss in that 1927 season.
And that's what many sports columnists and sports writers strongly felt. It's interesting. You mentioned the A's and they had signed Zach Wheat and Eddie Collins. Connie Mack really felt like he had a great opportunity to catapult the Yankees and win it all that year. And they finished way back. In fact, they were so far back that at one point in September, Ty Cobb he left. He said, "I'm going to go hunt. We got no shot at catching these guys, so I'm gone. I'm going to go hunt."
He said, "They don't let me bet on these meaningless games anymore, so I'm out of here."
Exactly. But just a tremendous season, and Ruth's year was. It really did rescue baseball because, that was before all the great promotions and marketing we've seen in baseball over the last 20, 30 years. It was long before the San Diego Chicken and things of that nature, the Philly Fanatic and things like that. But in those days, you had to be a pennant contender if you were going to draw. And if you weren't in contention, you didn't draw very well. And a lot of those teams, the Browns, the White Sox, I mean, they were out of it early. And it was those dates with the Yankees that really brought in the big crowds and rescued those teams from potential financial calamity that year.
And then the World Series against the Pirates, I had never seen these quotes by some of these National League managers. I couldn't believe this after the season the Yankees had. And the one manager says, granted, the Yankees are a good club. We have about 5 of them in the National League. I mean, we're talking about the 1927 New York Yankees who've completed the whole regular season at this point. It's not like, it's April or whatever, that these guys couldn't even grant the Murderers Row Yankees any sort of, it must be that the league stinks. That's why the record is so good.
And Andrew, that goes back to what we talked about earlier about the nature of the two separate leagues at that time and how deeply embedded the belief in one's league, the league couldn't be any good. They just couldn't because we're the National League. And you're right. It was really interesting to come across those quotes from National League managers really dismissing the Yankees as just being another team, and they'd finished mid-pack if they were in our league, and then they go out. That was a pretty darn good Pittsburgh team that they just destroyed and beat in 4 straight.
All right. Well, Dan, this was a lot of fun. We really enjoyed this. We do all sorts of stuff on here on this show, but we don't. We hadn't really done a lot of Ruth stuff. We've obviously touched on him in various episodes, but this was good to sort of do some Ruth stuff. And then this scandal is just a really sort of interesting moment that a lot of people don't know, even if they know about the Black Sox scandal and that type of thing from the era that we're talking about here in baseball history. So thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, this was fun. Thanks for the opportunity. It was great to be with both of you guys. Thank you.
We will link the book when we post the episode, but the book is Baseball at the Abyss, The Scandals of 1926, Babe Ruth, and the Unlikely Savior Who Rescued a Tarnished Game by Dan Taylor, who's been our guest tonight.
Absolutely. And thank you all, as always, for joining us. And until next time, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.